you all for coming this evening. My name is Janelle Olverding. I'm the Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the college. I want to thank you for coming to this first in our series of guest lectures that we've set up for this spring. We're really excited about this. Just thought this was a great opportunity to bring the community out to campus and share some information with all of you with our on and off campus community. So we're excited that you're here. I wanted to introduce our first speaker in the series tonight. You'll welcome Mark Johnson. Mark's a fellow with the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Education Initiatives. He's been a teacher of history for over 20 years and has been recognized for excellence in the field of education with numerous national and international awards. So his current area of research is the history of Chinese communities in Montana, which I'm really excited to hear about tonight. So Mark, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Janelle. I just want to first start by thanking Dr. Mickelson and Kathleen O'Leary and Tracy and Janelle and just the whole Dawson Community College family. I've been out here a number of times and I've always been impressed with the programs, the instructors, the students. I just am so impressed with what I see in the work that's being done here. So I'm so happy to be a part of it every time I come out, and I always promote DCC wherever I go. It's such a great option, and I hope you learned a little bit something new tonight, but just understand how thankful I am to be featured in this exciting guest lecture series. So, as Janelle said, I teach for the University of Notre Dame, but I live in Helena, Montana. Native Montanan growing up, grew up in Great Falls, went to Carroll College. I did leave the state for a little bit, as people tend to do. Come on in, welcome. As people tend to do, you know, in their younger years, I went up to Boston, went to Seattle, went to some exotic places like that. And then my wife and I decided to make a little bit more radical decision and move to Shanghai, China, where we lived for 8 years. And as I did that, I began to realize that there is a diverse and fascinating Chinese history in my beloved home state of Montana. And so I began to marry my love of Montana with my interest in Chinese history, world history, and Montana's history. Found some interesting resources and want to try and tell this story in what I hope are new ways. So I joked with some of you, or you thought I was joking with some of you when I said there's audience participation tonight. There very much is. It's not a sit and get, it's not a sit and listen to me for 90 minutes. There's some of that. But I'm going to ask you to call on some prior knowledge. I'm going to ask you to interpret, analyze, just like I did with my students when I was teaching in Shanghai, China, or where I teach now at the University of Notre Dame. If they just sit and listen to me, it's not as meaningful as if they construct knowledge and try to interpret and grapple with these ideas a little bit on their own. So you're my students tonight, and so I'm going to ask that of you. So first of all, the question that I want you to ask is, what do we know about Chinese history? How many of you took a Montana history class when you were growing up? Okay, maybe a semester long. You probably spent half of that time talking about the Chinese experience in the Rocky Mountain region. Not quite so much? Okay. What do we know about Montana's Chinese pioneers? What do we know about them? Turn and talk to the person close to you, geographically, not necessarily relationally. Introduce yourself, maybe if you don't know them. What do you know about this Chinese experience in Montana? There were Chinese people here. There are Chinese people here. At one time, there was a lot more Chinese people here than there are currently today. What brought them here? What type of roles did they fill? How were they treated? Turn and talk. Let's give 25, 30 seconds. Go ahead. Take about another 10 seconds. All right, should I call on people individually or allow people to raise hands? How do you want to do this? Raise hands? Okay. What are some reasons that brought the Chinese here? Mining. Definitely gold mining, absolutely, absolutely. Just like California, just like many of the western states. In fact, in the Chinese way of speaking about America, does anybody know what they call California or San Francisco area? Called Jinshan, which means gold mountain. And so they very much, that was one of the first reasons that brought the Chinese to the West. In fact, in 1848, when gold was struck outside of San Francisco, the story says that news of that strike of gold reached China before it reached Washington, D.C. And so there's some interesting, definitely mining aspects bringing the Chinese to the western United States. What else? What other roles in terms of labor did they serve? Railroads, absolutely, railroad building. And those definitely were niches that they filled in Montana, but pretty quickly into their time here, they were pushed out of those roles. So here we see a drawing of some of the Chinese railroad workers depicted in the 1870s and 1880s. And in fact, in 1868, there was an agreement between the United States and China that allowed for free migration of Chinese to come and build the railroads. And there was something called most favored nation status, where the Chinese would get treated in very beneficial ways while here constructing the infrastructure of the American West and the United States overall. Sadly, that treatment didn't last, that positive treatment didn't last. Yes?
There's gold mining aspect. Were they gold mining for themselves? They had claims, or they went on stake claims, versus, well, I had my mind with the mining that they were doing restaurants and laundry, that kind of thing. So
you know your history.
Yeah. Go out and stake claims.
Good question. Let me just verbalize that for people who maybe didn't hear. The question is in the gold mining, did the Chinese come here and individually prosper from staking their own claims and pulling gold out of the ground and enriching themselves? Early on, a little bit. In California, however, very early on, there was what was called a foreign miners tax in 1852, and the gold rush was 1849, so it happened pretty quickly. The foreign miners tax, do you think that taxed German miners, Irish miners, Polish miners? It was very specifically against the Chinese. And that kind of reaction to any prosperity that they enjoyed followed them throughout the Rocky Mountain region. So to your question about did they own claims, here in Montana early in the 1870s, Chinese claim ownership was restricted. The language was that only people who were citizens or who could become citizens could own mining claims. So again, those German, Irish, Polish miners, they had an avenue to citizenship. Sadly, at this point in American history, Chinese people could not become naturalized citizens. That will change only in 1943. And in fact, more to the point of general mining across Montana, of course we know about gold mining, but in Butte, quickly the gold and the silver kind of played out, and then it became underground copper mining, and for 60 years, Chinese were prohibited from working in the underground mines in Butte. And then, to your point about they moved into the laundry work and the restaurant work, it was really because those were the only niches that were open to them, that were left open to them. So yes, railroad and gold mining early on, but pretty quickly those avenues for advancement dried up. Okay. How were they treated? I just kind of went over that a little bit. So now let's talk about how many were there. In the 1870 census, and this is before Montana is a state, of course, so this is a territorial census, as much as 15% of Montana's territory was Chinese. At least 10%, and some experts go as high as 15% of Montana in 1870 was Chinese. So this is not insignificant.
Do you have any idea, like, the percentage of German and Norwegian or any other ethnic?
I don't know off the top of my head. It will change as things ebb and flow. But in the 2010 census, less than 1/10% of all Montana was Asian of any nationality. So Montana had a very high amount of diversity early on, not so much now.
What was the population, when that census was taken for Montana?
So that for the 10 to 15%, that was about 1,200 Chinese. So we're talking about a small territorial population to begin with. Okay? Now we should be able to look at that census because when the census taker comes around, knocks on the door, and asks questions, we get demographic information, right? we should be able to break open that census and get a little bit more detail on who these Chinese people were. And here's what we find. Here's the census from 1870, or at least a snapshot of it. I don't read cursive very well. What does that say? China man, China man, China woman, China boy, China woman, China man. So the census takers were not recording the names of these individuals. And so much of their details are lost to us. We do have age, we do have gender, but can we know more about these individuals? Many historians think no, and this is a common kind of way of thinking about the Chinese in Montana. Traces of their culture have disappeared, and their stories have become obscured in myth and legend. They've been lost to the myths of history. And so a lot of times when you hear about the Chinese in Montana today, or the Chinese history of Montana, you hear about opium dens, Tong wars, Chinese tunnels, kind of these exotic, mystical type of things. They were here once, but they've since disappeared. And isn't it sad that we can't know more about them? But they've been lost to the mist of history. Not good enough. Not good enough, in my opinion. Okay? Because I want to know what's on his mind. Does he look like a man capable of deep thought? Does he look like he has hopes and dreams, motivations, face challenges, work to overcome challenges? I think so. And I think through trying to recover his story, we can get a much richer understanding of the Chinese experience in Montana and overall Montana history, and not stop at that they've been lost to the mist of history. So we have to try and work to understand his experiences. But did he even consider himself Chinese? And thus the title of my talk, Becoming Chinese in Montana. To be honest, when he came in the 1860s or 70s, he probably didn't consider himself bound by this greater national idea of being Chinese. He probably considered himself of a family group, a clan group, a linguistic group, and from a very specific part of China. So the vast majority of the Chinese who came, 60 to 70% or more of the Chinese who came during the gold rush and railroad mining days came from Guangzhou province, around what used to be called Canton or Guangdong, and more specifically from a certain set of counties, more specifically from a certain county within these four counties called Taishan, as you can see here. The vast majority of the Chinese who came from Taishan. Not from Beijing, not from Shanghai, but from this very small part of southern China that experienced famine and drought and flood and war, all these push factors sending them out, whereas gold mining and railroad opportunities pulled them to America. And they would have spoken very specific dialects that would have been unintelligible to Chinese 30 or 60 miles away. So they thought of themselves as a family group, a clan group, and a regional group, bound together by linguistic similarities, but also separated from other Chinese people by linguistic differences. And so we have to try and understand what they thought of themselves as, even at the same time as the American government thought of all the people from this certain part of the world as Chinese. And in 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It doesn't take a lot of critical thinking and problem solving to realize what the Chinese Exclusion Act's goal was: to exclude the Chinese. The only ethnic group, national group that has been so specifically named in immigration restriction. That was re-upped in 1892 with something called the Gary Act, which gave a little bit more teeth to it. And it was set to expire every 10 years. In 1902, they renewed it in perpetuity. So the Chinese Exclusion Act got more and more restrictive, more and more exclusionary. Finally, it wasn't ended until the Magnuson Act in 1943. What's the broader context of 1943? Why would America become more friendly with China in 1943? Yep. Allies with the Chinese against the Japanese. And it wasn't very sightly to have such a restrictive immigration policy against our wartime allies. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act was canceled in 1943, and Chinese were allowed to emigrate to the United States with a quota of 105 per year. Not 105,000, 105 Chinese per year were allowed to come. But at this point in time, they were also allowed to become naturalized citizens, and so it's more on a path towards equality in some senses that will finally be realized much more fully in 1965 or so. And so the U.S. government passed these laws from the top down, trying to keep Chinese workers out. And there was also quite a bit of bottom-up action against the Chinese. As victims of mass expulsion or violence, this is by far not all-inclusive of where this happened, but in California you can see a number of different actions against the Chinese. In 1871 there was a major riot in Los Angeles against the Chinese community there, quite violent. Here's Washington. In the 1880s, 1885, 1886, Chinese were expelled from Tacoma. Chinese were pushed out of Seattle. And so you see a number of different actions against the Chinese in California, in Washington, in Oregon. In 1887, more than 30 Chinese were massacred right on the border of Oregon and Idaho, killed for their gold, and really nobody was brought to justice for these actions. I was at the placing of this memorial tombstone, which is in English, in Chinese characters, and in Nez Perce, because that's a tribal affiliation of the land where that happened. In Idaho, there was actions against the Chinese who were there for gold mining and railroad purposes. In Denver in 1880, there was a major anti-Chinese riot. In Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, almost 30 Chinese were killed in a dispute. So we've got California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Wyoming. What should I go to next? Where are we? Montana. Okay. I didn't get a chance to upload that one. I must have sent the wrong copy. For all intents and purposes, there was not mass violence against the Chinese communities in Montana. There was not mass violence against the Chinese communities in Montana. Okay. That doesn't mean that there weren't occasional outbursts and occasional individual murders. There certainly were. But in terms of mass uprisings of mob violence against the Chinese residents of Montana, it didn't happen in the same way it did in Rock Springs, Wyoming, or Denver, or Los Angeles, Tacoma, Seattle, all those different places. I've been researching this for a long time. I'm still not totally sure that I understand why, but I'm going to try to put forward some ideas about that tonight. But I think sometimes you can look at the Chinese experience in the West, and because it's hard for us to get into their mindset, either because of a language barrier in the documents that exist, or that there are not many documents that exist, and it can become tempting to look at the Chinese in the West as people to whom things happen. They were passive, and the Chinese exclusion happened to them, or this expulsion or this massacre happened to them. I want to, again, break into the mindset of this gentleman and not look at him as a passive victim, but look at him as active, empowered, thoughtful, motivated, caring, compassionate, working with other people, trying to understand his hopes and dreams, not lost to the mist of history. Okay? And his comrades. So it's not just him. There's a couple of them. Oh, there's more. There's even more. Okay? Here's the document I have right here, and it's up on the screen digitally. This is the Chinese Empire Reform Society of Butte, Montana. Maybe Butte, America. Sorry, I missed it. And so we've got this Chinese Empire Reform Society of Butte. This photograph was taken in 1901, and when I found this, I had a number of questions. I thought, is this just a one-off? Is this just some crazy document? I don't know what it is. No, it's not, because I found one from Marysville, Montana. Smaller in terms of the number of people pictured, but if you know Marysville, Montana, it's not surprising. And so I began to ask questions. Here's the Marysville, Montana one. And I looked very closely at it, and questions came up. And so now I ask you, what questions do you have? If you'd like, as a teacher, I understand people's attention spans are about 12 to 15 minutes before they need to kind of refocus and move a little bit. Otherwise, you can drift off, start checking your phone, start thinking about your shopping list, things like that. So now is about that time. If you'd like to come up and stretch your legs and get a close look here at the Marysville one, please do. This is the Butte one. I've blown up the other one. This is the Marysville one as well, with the masthead kind of enlarged. So talk to the people close to you. What questions does this bring up?
Well, where's Marysville?
Marysville, good question. Anybody know where Marysville, Montana is? It used to be called Belmont. About 30 minutes north of Helena. It's an old ghost town. It's by Great Divide Ski Area. So it's right outside of Helena. Okay.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you actually living in
I can read some.
Do they have similar names and similar, like they would be multi-generational?
Great question. A lot of times the Chinese in view, they're from a couple of different families, the Hum family, and so you see that character repeated, and the Chuan family. And so that's, again, the clan affiliation, kind of that chain migration of connections that you have back with your relatives.
Did many women come over with the China?
Great question as well. Back when you saw that 1870 census, you saw China woman. There definitely were some Chinese women here in the American West. Stereotypically, they were many times viewed as working as prostitutes. And so a lot of times when Chinese men would try to bring their wives over, immigration officials would assume that they were prostitutes. In 1875, there was an act that was passed that was very specific against Chinese women coming in because they wanted to stop prostitutes from coming in. This then created a situation where, again, they couldn't become naturalized citizens, but if they do have children who are born here, that child is an American citizen by being born on American soil. But without many Chinese women here, the question is, did they then marry outside of their ethnic group? Not much. In 1909, there was an anti-miscegenation law that was passed that did not allow Chinese, that restricted Chinese from marrying outside of the Chinese group. That law was on the Montana books until 1953. And so a lot of times they would be criticized for not assimilating, not putting down roots, always wanting to go back to China. And many of them did have dreams of going back to China, enriched by the wealth they earned here on Gold Mountain. But they couldn't put down roots because of the 1875 law, because of the anti-miscegenation law. So there was a lot that was set up to kind of make it so that it was very difficult for them to assimilate. Good question. Other questions about these documents we have here? So we've got some family names that we see. What about the name of the organization itself? The Chinese Empire Reform Association. Break that down. We understand what Chinese is. What does the word reform seem to indicate? Change. Yeah, they have some goals. Empire. What are we talking about with empire?
They're trying to become, take over.
Good question. And are we talking about here on American soil that this goal is for? Or is it somehow tied back to China? These are all questions that came up for me. How many of you have been to Marysville, Montana? Kathleen. Okay, so we see here, this is the Chinese Empire Reform Association for Marysville, Montana. You see these fine-looking gentlemen here. They've got some titles. See this person here, we'll talk about him in just a little bit. And you see these very large naval vessels, because Marysville is obviously a good deep water port. No. So there's a question going on. Why are they putting these naval vessels on this? And it's not a throwaway thing. They very intentionally cut these out from somewhere and intentionally place those on that banner of the Chinese Empire Reform Association of Marysville. The Butte one doesn't have it. So they're trying to tell us something and tell themselves something with that.
They were on the coast is where they came from.
Yeah.
And that played part of in being part of the sea.
So maybe it's definitely a sea connection. I would say these are naval vessels, not just, I mean, they're military vessels. So something is being said with that. And then similarities, we see a similar nature to these photo montages. But we see this gentleman here, same guys over there in Marysville. Maybe a little bit more enhanced with this sun idea and the rays of the sun emanating from it. So as I found these documents, I started digging around and asking all these questions. And there have been quite a few people who have looked into the Chinese history of Montana. I don't think they've looked into the Chinese history of Montana seen through a Chinese history lens. Okay? And so that's what we're trying to do tonight. Yes, ma'am?
I would wonder too, with the word empire, different cultures use words differently.
Mm-hmm.
Could empire mean also being part of a nation?
So a growing sense of national identity, and you're absolutely right that they do begin to bind themselves together through their Chineseness in this. So they do cross those clan boundaries and those family boundaries and begin to think of Chinese goals, not family-based goals, not clan-based goals, not regional goals, but broader Chinese goals. Very good point. As I began to research this, I realized the guy in the top, his title is the Guangxu Emperor. In the documents that you read a little bit later, he's called the Guangxu Emperor. As the language changed, how we transliterated that language changed as well. So nowadays, the capital of China is Beijing. What had it been called at one time during your life? Peking. It's just same city, just kind of different ways of transliterating the Chinese characters. So we will call this gentleman the Guangxu Emperor. The documents you read will call him the Guangxu Emperor, same person. And so I began to ask myself, who is this guy? What's going on with him? Is he the emperor of the Empire Reform Society? Why does he need reform? Why does he need help from some Chinese guys in Marysville, Montana? And the reason he needs help is because of this young lady, his aunt. She is the Dowager Empress, and I always pronounce her name wrong, so I'm going to need some audience participation on how to say her name correctly. Does anybody know how to say her name? Dr. Lee. Cixi. She is a strong lady. She has been in charge of China since this young man was born, basically, and she's ruling in his stead. She's the Dowager Empress. Not the rightful ruler. She's supposed to rule until he's old enough and wise enough to rule. Problem is she likes power. And so she's been reluctant to turn over power. But she's getting up in years, and she does decide in the early 1890s, about 1893, to begin to move into retirement and to allow the rightful ruler, the Guangxu Emperor, to take charge of China. 1893, 1894, things aren't going very well for China at this point in time. There's been this movement called a self-strengthening movement, where China tried to strengthen itself from within without really taking on Western principles or ideas or educational reforms. It didn't go very well because they came up against a nation in the East that had taken on Western military reforms and had done very well with it. Japan had adopted many Western modernizations and militarizations, and Japan fought against China in 1894, 1895, and it did not go well for China. And so there are some in China who think that self-strengthening approach isn't the way we need to go. These two gentlemen here, Kang Yo-wei in the bottom left, Liang Qichao in the bottom right. I'm not going to test you on the names or pronunciations, but to be honest, these guys are very important to our story tonight. Kang is thought by many to be maybe the most brilliant Confucian scholar of all of Chinese history, and Liang Qichao was his student. Brilliant, brilliant individuals. And they're troubled by what they see in China. Yes?
Where are they located?
They were both from southern China, but at this point in time they're up in Beijing. And so they've taken the Confucian imperial exams, and it's a meritocracy. If you do well enough on these exams, you can become an official, and you can help the emperor rule with your wisdom. And so they see problems with China. China's just been defeated horribly. It's in danger of being further carved up. Already America and the British and the Germans and the Russians and the French are carving up China. Things are not going well. And now Japan is threatening to carve up even more of China. And so Kang Yo-wei and Liang Qichao try to get an audience with the emperor and tell him we need to move forward in a different direction. Self-strengthening didn't work. And Kang is writing a number of offerings to the Guangxu emperor. Finally, he gets an audience with the Guangxu emperor, and supposedly, some people think this is apocryphal, that this is maybe an exaggeration, but his audience with the emperor went on for 5 hours. The longest audience with the Chinese emperor in Chinese history. And at that audience, Kang, this brilliant, brilliant man, says, we need to move forward in different ways. We need to issue some reforms. Let's call them the 100 days of he didn't call them the 100 days of reforms, but it gives you an idea how long they'll last. How long do you think they'll last? 103 days, they rounded, okay. But you can tell that it's going to be stopped. The 100 days of reform will not succeed. But Kang and Liang think that they've got the ear of the emperor, and they do. And so they say, we need to move forward and westernize and modernize and reform, as you said, make progress and change. Kang says, a survey of all the states in the world will show that those states that undertook reforms became strong, while those states that clung to the past perished, and China was clinging to the past. If your Majesty observes the trends in other countries, we need change. We can preserve ourselves, but if we can't change, we shall perish. Kang goes on to inspire the emperor to move forward. There's the Marysville image again, with a number of different things. We need to create a modern navy. Study European and American governments and militaries and pick what we think is the best and most applicable for China moving forward. The Japanese had done many of these things, and they just whipped the Chinese in 1894-95. Kong says we need to modernize in these ways. Reform education, economics, foreign affairs, reward investors and authors and entrepreneurs, establish modern mines and railroads. If only we knew some Chinese who knew some things about mining and railroad building. Okay? So we need to do all these things to make China strong again. One of the other reformers named Tan Tong begins to be a little bit critical though, because he says, these are great ideas, but for a long time, it was prohibited for Chinese scholars to go outside of China and try to learn from other cultures. China was not exactly humble. It's the characters that make up China, Zhongguo means middle kingdom. They thought it was basically the center of the earth. So it didn't really have humility and think that it could learn from others. And Tan Tong, one of these reformers, he does agree with Tong and Leong. He agrees with these ideas, but he says this is flawed. Where have we had genuine understanding of foreign cultures? When have we had scholars or officials who could discuss these ideas? These are foreign matters. And then China was defeated by Japan because we don't understand these ideas, and we prohibited learning from the outside world. You've never dreamed of or seen the beauty and perfection of Western legal systems and political institutions. All you speak of are the branches and foliage of foreign matters, not the roots. So Tan Tong was critical of this passage. He says we need to open up. I'm for it, but we need to be more open to going out and learning from the rest. Well, the problem was the Dowager Empress had retired, but wasn't too far away from the scenes, and she comes back and reasserts her control. She takes over again, and there's a coup that puts down the 100 Days of Reform. Most of the leaders are captured and executed. Those 6 individuals there are beheaded. And she puts herself back in charge. So that 100 Days of Reform was over, and there's a reaction. Tan Tong, as he's talking about, he knows he's going to be executed. He's been caught. He didn't really try to flee too much. And he says, hey, reform has never come about in any country without the flow of blood. Note here, he's not saying revolution is needed. He's saying sacrifice is needed. No one in China in modern times has sacrificed himself for the cause, and because of this, China is still poor and backward. Therefore, I request that the sacrifice begins with myself. And the night before he's executed, he writes this on the walls of the prison. Does that sound like anybody from American history? I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, or give me liberty, or give me death. Those type of ideas of sacrificing yourself, or being willing to sacrifice yourself for a greater cause. Tan Tong got the opportunity, and the Dowager Empress took him up on it. So 6 of the leaders are executed. There's that conservative reaction. The Dowager Empress is again back in control. The Guangxu Emperor is not executed. That would be unsightly. But he is placed under house arrest. He's placed under house arrest and locked away in the Forbidden City. And that will be where he is until he dies in 1908. We've got a long time for him to be in house arrest. Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao escape. They're secreted out of China to live in exile. But as they're living in exile, they continue these ideas of empire reform, and they continue to persist in trying to get the Guangxu Emperor back in charge and to depose the Dowager Empress. And so in exile, they look for Chinese who had knowledge of Western technology, knowledge of Western institutions, knowledge of Western ideas, and they're living in exile looking for those people. They begin the Chinese Empire Reform Association. They begin this in Victoria, British Columbia in 1899. And very quickly it takes over. It has more than 150 branches around the world: Australia, Singapore, Burma, Japan. Montana, I assert, had the largest concentration of branches in the entire world, with 12. So there's something exciting going on. And so Kang and Liang begin looking for help for their efforts. Liang Qichao visits San Francisco, a very large Chinese community in San Francisco, and he's not impressed. He is not impressed. Here's his primary source of what he thinks about the Chinese in San Francisco. I'm going to take a drink of water, and I'll let you read that to yourself. So he thinks they're too clannish, too fragmented, not bound together in a common cause. And and he's not hopeful. This is in 03. However, when Liang Qichao visits Montana, he finds that the Chinese in Montana are more organized, more bound together, more efficient than the Chinese he's interacted with anywhere else. And he's quite encouraged by that. Liang Qichao in exile visits these communities. So what's different about Montana's Chinese communities? We'll talk about that in just a second. Before I move on, any questions? Do you have your Guangxu straight from your Tong, from your Liang, all those things?
Who were the sympathizers in Montana?
Good question. Almost all of the Chinese here did want this Empire Reform Society to succeed. Now the question is, do they care that much about Chinese court politics? To be honest, no. They don't care Guangxu versus the Dowager Empress. But if China can be strengthened, how does that help them? They could go back, possibly. Possibly. How does that help them here? The Japanese weren't being pushed around as much as the Chinese were here in the American West. Why? Japan was a world power. It defeated China in 1894-95, defeated Russia in 1905, and America took note. Japanese residents here in America have the protection of a stronger government. And so if China becomes a stronger government, the Chinese here in Montana and the American West will be pushed around less. So it was in their best interest to see China rise and become stronger. I don't really think they cared that much about the court politics and things like that. I think they were looking out for the best interest, as we all do. But if China became stronger, they would have more protection. Good question. I think going to Tong Tong's idea that the Chinese officials didn't have ideas, true understanding of Western institutions and technologies. All they understood was the foliage and the branches, not the roots. I think Montana's Chinese understood the roots of Western technologies and Western institutions, and as we'll see. What I think happened is, a case happened in Butte in 1896-97. This is a couple of years before the 100 Days of Reform and Liang and Tong come through the state. There's really no chance that Montana's Chinese would ever have an opportunity to rub elbows with Tong Yowei or Liang Qichao. These guys are as big as it gets in Chinese intellectual circles. It'd be like if Ben Franklin swung through Glendive, something like that. I mean, that'd be amazing for a couple of different reasons now in 2019, but you get the idea. In terms of his intellectual firepower, that's Tong Yowei and Liang Qichao coming through Montana. So there's really no dreams of that back here in 1896-97. They haven't yet started the reform, they're not yet in trouble, they're not yet in exile, but the Chinese in Montana were in trouble. In 1896, the white-controlled Butte labor unions instituted a boycott against the Chinese in Butte. And they tried to enforce it so that nobody in Butte patronized Chinese businesses. Now, I already told you that the Chinese in Butte really weren't doing mining at this point in time. Really, they were involved in laundries and restaurant work. That's really the only niches that were left open to them. So the Butte labor unions tried to make it so that no non-Chinese give a cent of any of their hard-earned money to Chinese businesses. And some people willingly did this. Some people willingly went along with the boycott. What also happened is intimidation. You can see in the right-hand document, Mrs. George Althoff was still patronizing Chinese businesses. She needed to be shamed and kind of pressure put on her. And there'd be thugs outside Chinese restaurants or Chinese laundries trying to physically intimidate people from patronizing them. And so the Chinese were in trouble. And now this is 1896, 97. This is not too long after violence in Wyoming, violence in Colorado, violence in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, California. This could turn bloody. And so the Chinese wondered, do we just keep our heads down? Do we try and fight back? This is a pretty big Chinese community, about more than 300 Chinese in Butte at this point in time. And they wondered, what should we do? So they went to the Chinese Six Companies, also called the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. And whereas the Qing dynasty, the Qing government, the Chinese government really couldn't protect the Chinese in the American West, the Six Companies based out of San Francisco was kind of a benevolent organization. It kind of helped with some legal understandings and things like that, and it should provide some assistance. And so Butte's Chinese went to the Six Companies and said, we want to fight this boycott. Will you help us do that? We want to fight it legally. We want some lawyer fees. Will you help us get a lawyer and fight this? And these very serious men said, no, we're not going to help. You're crazy. Keep your heads down. This could get ugly. You're crazy to go against the labor unions and the American law. Well, the Chinese in Butte didn't take that as an answer, and they fought back. They fought it legally. You couldn't traipse all 300 Chinese through the courtroom to testify, so they sent a petition around Chinatown and got more than 300 signatures that said, yes, we want to fight this, you can speak for us. And about 5 Chinese leaders took this case to court. And you can see this document has signatures in Chinese characters and many in English as well. There's several pages to it, more than 300 individuals signed and said, we want to fight. So they got a lawyer named Wilbur Fisk Sanders, the famous Montana Sanders family. This guy was one of the early vigilantes, one of the early state senators, and he took up the Chinese case and fought it for them in court. He wins the case. He wins the case, based largely on the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law, and that this was not equal treatment. So they win this case. Monetarily speaking, they didn't win much. They really never got much redress financially. But it's the idea that they tapped into the American legal system and they used this to try to advocate for themselves in this struggle. Not lost to the mists of history, but active, engaged, motivated, collaborative with the goal. And they achieved that goal. They experienced empowerment and experience with these American institutions. And the Chinese 6 companies responded. Do they look impressed? That's the only good picture I've got of them. So I think they were impressed, and others were impressed when they saw this empowerment coming from Butte's Chinese community. Specifically, these 2 individuals, Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei, visit the Chinese communities in Butte, in Livingston, in Helena, all throughout the state, and they don't bring empowerment and enlightenment to the Chinese in Montana. That's what many people thought. Many Chinese scholars who looked at this know the elevated intellectual status of Kang and Liang, and they know the inexperience of the Chinese who came here to America. They were uneducated, many of them illiterate. And so the thought is, well, Kang and Liang are going to bring these things to the Chinese in Montana. It was the other way around. Kang and Liang were looking for help, and when they came to Montana, they found something special. Because of this empowerment, because of these experiences. They find that empowerment and they build upon it. So the view is that they can strengthen China, and that would be to Kang and Liang's benefit, because of Chinese court politics back home, but also to the benefit of the Chinese here. Everybody would benefit. And the way to do that was to get the Guangxu Emperor out of house arrest, to depose the Dowager Empress, and to reform the Chinese Empire, modernize, westernize, all of those things. And so it's not just these documents we have here. We actually have the Montana newspapers reporting on it as well. And in 1901, 2 of the branches of the Chinese Empire Reform Society in Montana became incorporated entities. They filed paperwork with the Secretary of State and incorporated. Isn't that kind of amazing? They're on the record as doing this. And they take note of it. Here are the Articles of Incorporation. It's for the general education and the principles of the Constitution and the laws of the U.S. We want arts and sciences, leading improvements, useful knowledge. In those Articles of Incorporation, they don't mention anywhere about the Dowager Empress or the Guangxu Emperor or anything like that. These are Montana state documents. They say these are the reasons we're meeting. We're an incorporated entity. What happened in Helena, what happened in Butte, very official. I want you to keep these ideas in mind, as I say it right down there. For the audience participation, the document analysis we'll do soon. I want you to see the document that I give you through the lens of these Articles of Incorporation. These are their goals. I like that word, amelioration. But even in this same article that praised the Chinese for their organization and for taking the steps to become an incorporated entity, again, using the institutions of the Western legal system, they were mocked at the same time. They were mocked through a mocking drawing of them. And what you'll notice here, they're playing cards, they're smoking, possibly smoking opium, but this hairstyle, this long braid coming down there, take note of that. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. It's called the queue. It's this long ponytail down their back that Chinese men wore. Okay? And they're also mocked for other reasons. The same article said, yeah, the Chinese in Helena, they're very strong. They're so strong that if you stand at the corner, you can smell them from a mile away. Right? So they're mocked at the same time that they're standing up for themselves. Do you think the Chinese cared about that mocking? To be honest, no. If they could take charge of themselves, feel proud of themselves, and prove themselves, that's what they were looking for. Now, if that mocking turned violent or abusive, they were willing to fight back legally. And in terms of that Articles of Incorporation, this is the actual document. You can see who signed it, what their positions are. Many of them wrote in English. This gentleman wrote in Chinese characters. His mark in Chinese, his Chinese signature. And I've looked at this document a number of times, and I know the history of these gentlemen who did this on the right, but a name popped up that I wasn't familiar with. This guy here, Gong He. And I found that interesting, and so I did a little bit more work on him. And this is Gong He. He visited Montana in 1901. He wasn't from Montana. He's from Portland, Oregon. He's got an interesting story, in my opinion, that helps us see through his lens, through the lens of what we're looking at for him, this overall story of what the Chinese were looking for. He's a self-taught electrician. He actually wrote an electrical textbook in Chinese, the first one, based on a number of textbooks, electrical textbooks in English that he had here when he was teaching himself. And he decided in 1903 to go back to China, go back to his home province of Guangzhou, to teach his countrymen what he knew and what they ought to know about electrical light. To do my part in awakening of China. I have no idea what happened to him, but seen through this lens of the Chinese Empire reform and the skills that he gained here in the American West that he could take back with him to China, I was fascinated by Gong He. He spoke English fluently, he was self-taught, and so he traveled with these groups as they came to Montana to try and help this reform society, help them write those Articles of Incorporation. Here's a document, not actual size, this is an artifact from Butte, dug up in 2007 by Mitzi Rosalind, as they were doing an excavation in Butte's. You know, there's still quite a few buildings related to Butte's Chinatown, if you've ever been there or if you ever go there. There's a fascinating museum called the Meiwa Museum. It's really, really well done. And so the Butte Chinatown has a lot of physical remnants left. Unfortunately, Helena's Chinatown was pretty much razed with the urban renewal in the 1950s and 1960s. There's still one building in Helena that may have a connection back to Helena's original Chinatown. Buildings, I'm not so sure. It did have a big Chinese community. I'm not sure about the physical presence there. The place to see this today is still Butte, very much so. And as they were doing some digging, they found this metal document. And so this is the Guangzhou Emperor, CERA, Chinese Empire Reform Association, and the Chinese characters along here, Bao Huang Hui, what it would be called. You got the Qing Dynasty flag here, and the flag of the Chinese Empire Reform Association. And other medallions like this have been found around the world. That excites me to think that Butte's Chinese, Montana's Chinese, were connected with Chinese in Burma, in Australia, in Japan, around the world in this effort. This is a picture of when Tong Yue actually visited. So this is maybe the most brilliant Confucian scholar of all time, standing here on the banister. He's got his interpreter and his bodyguard with him. These are the only three Chinese pictured in the photograph here, because the stars of the photograph are the production team and the actors of the Ben-Hur production. It was put on in Butte in 1905 with working mechanical horses for the chariot scene. Yeah, and they're taking a tour of the original mine. And so Tong Yue and his comrades went on this tour as well, because remember, some of those goals of the Chinese Empire Reform Association, railroads, mining. China has vast mineral wealth, and if we can learn Western mining technologies, maybe we can strengthen China. So Tong's in Butte going in the underground mines to try and figure out what he can about mining technologies. Liang and Tong visit in 03 and 05 respectively. And again, as I assert, they didn't bring empowerment. I think they thought they were going to. I think they thought the Chinese everywhere they visited would be like the Chinese in San Francisco, who they found to be clannish and fragmented. They didn't find that when they came here to Montana. Now here's all the branches. I'm pretty certain that these branches were where I say they were. There are some people who don't think there are quite 12. Liang Qichao reported that there were 12 in Montana, but sometimes he exaggerated a little bit for his purposes. But I found evidence of about 10 out of 12 of these, and I think I'm pretty strong in asserting that there were 12. And again, like I mentioned, I assert that this is the greatest concentration of branches of this society in the world, here in our beloved home state of Montana. So let's test your Montana geography. Okay? We've got Helena, Where is this one? Marysville. Good. We've got Missoula. This would be Kalispell. We've got Butte and Anaconda. We've got Bozeman and good. Billings. We've got Miles City. Savvy. I'm going up, sorry. What do we have over here? Havre. Cut Bank would be up higher. Fort Benton. Very good. Fort Benton. So those are 12 branches that I assert were there. Okay. Now you've been sitting and listening to me for quite a little bit, so now's the document analysis portion. Soon I'm going to have my partners here pass out some documents. What I want you to do is to read the newspaper document and to try and figure out what's the goal that is being expressed in this document and how do they work to achieve that. You're all going to get, well, you're probably going to have a different document from the person sitting close to you, and then I'm going to ask you to share the gist of that document with the person close to you. I've blown up the text a little bit. I know as I get older, I need a little bit of help like that. So. What's the overall goal of the Chinese who are working in that document you have? What are some things of interest that come up in the document? What do you find intriguing? The goals, what you find interesting, what you want to share with somebody sooner when I give you a moment to do that.
point in time I hear a little bit of conversation beginning, great. I would like you to find somebody who had a different document than you and share the gist. What's the main point? What did you find interesting? They're color-coded at the top with the use of Randy's highlighters. So there's purple. If you have purple, don't find somebody with purple. Take it away and share it, please. Do you think these guys are here to convert them? Absolutely. In your partnerships, make sure both people have a chance to share the main gist. What's the goal? What are some interesting tidbits that you found there? If you've already done that, feel free to float over to another group and kind of listen in on what they're doing. Let's give it another 2 minutes. There's 5 different colors. That's a good question. We'll talk about that. About one more minute before I assess your mastery of these documents. Okay, please conclude the thoughts you're currently discussing. What
are some interesting ideas that came up out of these documents? Now, none of these newspaper articles were written by Chinese authors. So these are very much white journalists interviewing the Chinese, reporting on the Chinese. But do you get a sense that the journalists had a pretty good understanding of what the Chinese Empire Reform Association was advocating? In some ways, yeah. It talks about the Guangxu Emperor, it talks about the Dowager Empress and those court politics. I'm impressed by their level of understanding of what's going on. And I'll be honest with you, many of these out of the Anaconda Standard, generally did not have very laudatory reporting on the Chinese. Anaconda was pretty opposed to the Chinese, and oftentimes that was reflected in the Anaconda Standard.
So because Anaconda is so close to you, did they have the same kind of where they were trying to shut down the businesses in Anaconda?
Good question. They did. The Chinese community in Anaconda was quite a bit smaller, and so these reports were about the Butte Chinese community. Unfortunately for the Chinese in Anaconda, those boycotts, the similar boycotts, not exactly the same one in 96, 97, were more successful, and the Chinese in Anaconda were basically driven out. It wasn't an expulsion like Tacoma or Seattle necessarily. The Chinese in Anaconda chose to go elsewhere and join other Chinese communities in Montana.
So do you think the people of Anaconda were threatened by the Chinese success? Like they're building their own armies and...
So building their own armies. I don't know anything about this. Unless I had the document in orange, I don't know anything about this. Tell us more. Janine, tell us about the...
I don't have it anymore. I created it. So
It's right here. I know it's right here. You got it. So military, army. What's going on with the Chinese in this military?
Each member has a Spanish Mauser rifle and a uniform that consists of regulations, white hat, yellow cord, a band, and cross arms designating a number of the company.
So the Chinese in Butte actually formed militia brigades, trained with real weapons, did drills and marches in secret outside the prying eye of the Butte non-Chinese residents? No. Very publicly. Did they do target practicing with live ammunition? Probably not. Yeah. Down at the cemetery, down on the flats. They were target practicing out there, and they got pretty good at their marksmanship, it says. That blows my mind that in 1896-97, the Butte labor unions tried to push the Chinese out and almost succeeded. And by, when was the document, the orange document?
1905.
By 05, they're being reported on as having this military, this militia active. They're giving commands in English. They've got some Chinese officers. They've got real weapons. In 05, these Spanish Mausers probably would have been surplus weapons from the Spanish-American War, 1898, around that time period. And actually, this was a broader trend. This was not just the Chinese in Butte. Across the branches of the Chinese Empire Reform Association, many of them formed a militia. Their goal is not military violence against non-Chinese people here in America. What's their goal? Go back to China and get him out of house arrest. And so it was kind of a harebrained scheme, right? They're drilling in Tongyo Way. He gets some military advisors. He gets this really interesting guy named Homer Lee. His name is spelled L-E-A, but it's pronounced Lee. And he convinced, some people believe that he convinced Kong that he was a distant relative of Robert E. Lee. Okay? And Robert E. Lee, Homer Lee, maybe they were Chinese, not Lee. They were military experts. And so Kong tries to have this military expedition to go back and conquer China for the Guangxu Emperor. Do you really think the Chinese in Butte expect to be this conquering army back in their motherland? No. But if they can be stronger, hold themselves a little bit more upright, and be a little bit more robust in Butte, maybe they won't get pushed around. And so there are these military branches that are openly drilling, training, target practicing in Butte in 1905.
Do you think it's all over that they have these different cells of militia?
Yeah, they did in Los Angeles. They did in some other branches of the Chinese Empire Reform Association. I haven't seen evidence of that in the other 11 branches in Montana. But the Butte one was very much, there was a lot of reporting on that. And so I trust that that was it. It could have spread. I haven't seen evidence of that. But that they're militarily marching and that strong in 05 blew my mind. And then by 06 or 07, when things kind of peter out, and basically that is seen to be a pipe dream. Some newspaper reporters come to those militia organizations and say, "Ha, what are you going to do now? It's a pipe dream, it's disappeared. What are you going to do now?" And they were really mocking of the Chinese, and the Chinese said, "I don't know, I think we're going to continue to drill, it's good for the boys." Right? So they're standing up straighter, they're feeling more proud of themselves, they're getting pushed around less, that empowerment from these efforts. Court politics, we're not that interested in it, but if it can make us less susceptible to being pushed around here, great. So that militarization from that orange document was fascinating. What about the green document? Anybody have the green document, want to share some ideas from that? I think that's in Billings, right?
Yeah.
What's the gist of the green document?
Well, they had a meeting at the Reverend, and this is Remington, First Baptist Church volunteered their services as instructors in English, and they're teaching members of the school to read and write.
Good, let me stop you there, and if you couldn't hear, the Reverend and Mrs. Remington, non-Chinese residents of Billings, have this school, are teaching these Bible lessons to the Chinese in Billings. And the Chinese in Billings are eating it up.
What year is that?
What year is that from?
1901.
01. It's pretty early, and it references the Chinese Empire Reform Association. Tom Chuang, who was a prominent member of the Chinese community of Billings, is quoted in there. But have I said anything about adopting Christianity to this point? We've talked about Western technologies, Western education, Western legal understandings. I haven't talked about Christianity at all. And I'll tell you, the Chinese Empire Reform Association really didn't care that much about Christianity. I believe that the Reverend and his wife do, and they're trying to gain converts, absolutely. So what do Tom Chuang and his brothers in Billings, why are they going to these Bible lessons? To learn English. To learn English. And if somebody will teach them English, if it's about the book of Genesis, great. If it's about an electrical manual, great. I need to learn English so that we can empower ourselves and empower China and seize these opportunities. I have not seen much missionary activity or proselytizing activity or Christian activity amongst the Chinese Empire Reform Association, and so we infer what might be on the mind of Tom Chuang and the Billings Chinese community. What about the purple document?
To establish a big Chinese college out of Butte in 1903.
03, to establish a big Chinese college out of Butte. Good.
They want to create an industrial complex
Yep.
where they can train young boys, and then the goal seems to be to send them back to China
Yep.
and develop a language that is cohesive to China, so
Great.
that they can teach and spread what they learn here, take that back to China and educate the common person.
A technical college here to train young men to go back and bring those technical skills and that leadership back to China. Very, very good. Sounds like Montana Tech.
Don't we have all of this kind of, it started, I don't know what year,
Sure.
that we kind of partnered with China to help them get out of this situation or condition that they were in, and we still goes on today with them.
Yeah, there was a couple of efforts. Several dozen young boys were brought to Yale earlier in like the 1850s, 60s possibly. Those gentlemen who were educated here in America, when they went back, they were the leaders of that self-strengthening movement that I mentioned. But they were of a very specific class of Chinese. They were from the elite, they had opportunities. The Chinese who we're talking about here getting this technical education, it's of a different class of Chinese. They're the ones who have not had much in their lives. They're supporting family members back home through their hard work in the laundry or the restaurant here. And education was not really much of a reality for them here or back in China. So that technical, that vocational education, that practical education is what they're looking at there. You're right that there were these partnerships between the United States and China at certain times, but also in that document they say we hope that America will relax its immigration restrictions, allow more students to come over here and learn in this way and then go back to China to improve it. So we're talking about a different group of Chinese. That's a good distinction. Now you mentioned something about the language. I want to linger on that a little bit. Was that the purple document?
Yeah,
the big Chinese college in view. Anybody else have thoughts on that language aspect? Last paragraph of that document.
Well, you kind of discussed it a little because I was curious whether it says the Chinese dialect.
Yes.
And I thought there was different languages all along, and that's kind of what we determined.
Yeah.
So I don't understand how they're going to have one cohesive when they're
That's a great question. That's a great question. It talks in the bottom paragraph. Dennis, can you read us about what their goal is with regard to those dialects?
Well, there's an endeavor that will be made to eliminate all dialects from the Chinese language and make one language universal in China. This will enable us to circulate literature more freely, for under present existing circumstances, one cannot travel more than 10 miles before he is confronted with a new dialect.
Yeah. So that dialect problem that stopped the free expression of ideas was holding China back. And if they could have one spoken dialect, the written language is, for all intents and purposes, the same. There's some changes that happened in the 1940s and 50s that complicate it. But if you can read Chinese characters, you can read Chinese characters. The way you verbalize them might be radically different. Okay? The different Chinese dialects verbalize the same Chinese written character in different ways, and that was holding back the Chinese from development and really maximizing their national goals. And so these Chinese are saying in, what was that, 03? We want this Chinese college and we want one spoken dialect that's across the nation instead of this fragmentation. So again, that idea of what the title of my talk, becoming Chinese in Montana, not becoming Taishanese or all these different dialects in different subgroups, becoming Chinese. And they were looking for that. And honestly, these Chinese here in Montana probably couldn't read Chinese characters that well. And so if you can't read the Chinese characters and you also speak different dialects from different people, the ways of moving forward as a cohesive group are very difficult. So I found that one interesting. Yes?
So how many of the Chinese population that was here could actually read?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I would say far less than half. Just knowing the circumstances they came from.
So they all knew their own language from where they came from?
Yeah, they would know their spoken dialect. And there's similarities. Is there one standard dialect in China today? Spoken dialect? Yeah, Mandarin. Now, if you're from Shanghai, you might speak Shanghainese, but all people, for all intents and purposes, speak Mandarin. And it's bound the nation together. Okay? And the written language has been simplified as well for mainland Chinese. Okay. So that was the purple document. We talked about the green document. I'd like to go into the pink document. The pink document piqued my interest. What are some of the goals in the pink document that you noticed that they want to take back to China? Randy, what did you think?
It says the reform movement is strictly an educational one, having as its object the lifting of the country and its people from the rut into which they were thrown so many years ago and have since remained by reason of the desire of the Empress to keep it there. She's holding back progress, and they want to reform her.
So they do talk about court politics, absolutely. Okay. What are some of the practical ways that they want to move forward with the skills they've gained here in Montana?
We want railroads and modern advantages possessed by other countries. We want a government that will not be under the domination of one person. We want a Congress and a Senate, the same as exists in the United States.
Railroads, a bicameral system of government. And in fact, that's what Kang Youwei and Yang Chiu were saying. They did want the Guangxu Emperor in power, but they didn't necessarily want an empire to continue, more of a constitutional monarchy, learning from those institutions of America. So we've got railroads. Is there mining referenced in there?
There is. It says the country is full of minerals, yet the Empress will not permit any mining enterprises to be conducted. We want these mineral resources developed.
Absolutely. So develop the rich mineral resources of China to strengthen China so as the Chinese everywhere can be protected. Fascinating, fascinating. Anything about the dress or hairstyles referenced in the pink document that we can tease out of it?
Yes, it says, prior to 275 years before this article, which was in 1905, Chinese did not
Yeah, so here we get into the dress and the hairstyle. And so this document from the Butte Chinese Empire Reform Association shows us part of that hairstyle. It's called the Q, and it was mandated that all Chinese men wear this as a sign of subservience to the Qing court. Now, the Qing dynasty has been in power since 1644, and this shows the Chinese population's subservience to the court. Okay? So the men would have to shave the front of their head and then wear that long ponytail down the back, that long braid down the back. You can't see it in this picture, but I guarantee you have it. It was a sign of loyalty, and the saying went that if you keep your hair, if you don't shave your hair here, if you keep your hair, you'll lose your head. I don't know how often that was instituted, okay? But a question came up here. Do they want to go back to China? For those of them that kept this hairstyle, it tells me yes, they do. And to be honest, that was their goal. Their goal was never to come to America and stay necessarily. They wanted to come to America, seize opportunities, send money back, and go back to China enriched and empowered. And we're not even talking about the Empire Reform Association. That was generally the goal of the Chinese who came to America. Not permanent movement to America, but movement for opportunity and then take that wealth back. And so when we see those who maintain this Q, maintain the shaved forehead and the ponytail down the back, it tells us that they still are within that Chinese mindset of wanting to go back. Do I have any documents from this gentleman where his diary entry says, I want to go back, I can't? No, but we can infer from his hairstyle choices. And so we set him next to another person here. What do you notice? Here's a Venn diagram, right? They're both in Butte, they're both in the Chinese Empire Reform Association. What are the differences?
One is very Americanized.
Very Americanized. Tell me why. Why you know that?
Short hair and it's not shaved back.
Very good.
Part and it's,
He is not shaved. I guarantee he doesn't have that braid down his back. He's made choices. Did anybody force this upon him? I think he chose to do this. I don't have his diary entry where he makes that decision, but I think we can kind of read his mind a little bit. So we've got Western hair. What else do we notice? Western dress. Western dress. Absolutely. Traditional Chinese dress. He chose that. Nobody forced him to be that picture that way. Western dress. All right? And so this is the Chinese Empire Reform Association of Beauty. You can kind of see some trends here. Look even closer at this gentleman. The pin. We know what this pin is, right? That's the Guangzhou Emperor. They're part of the Chinese Empire Reform Association, totally appropriate that he wears it. I don't know what that one is. I do know what that one is. Can you tell? It's hard to tell. A flag. What flag? It's the American flag. Of the 33 individuals pictured here, 3 of them have chosen to wear an American flag lapel pin. I don't have their diaries, but we can kind of read their mind, can't we? We can rescue them from the mists of the past. Here we see those trends. See a couple of them in Western dress. This gentleman doesn't have the American flag lapel pin. That's saying something with his choice not to wear it. Here we see very traditional, very traditional. That guy's a laugh, right? Okay, very traditional, very traditional. I'm fascinated by this guy. Turn and talk to the person close to you. Why are we fascinated by this guy? Can we read his mind? Turn and talk. That's a good question. Can we read his mind in this moment, or maybe, I'm going to say, a week before this moment? What's going on with this guy? Dr. DeGandhi, I want to hear your thoughts on him. Okay, but is it?
What am I supposed to know?
Can we infer from this gentleman some choices he's making? What sartorial choice did he make? Is he dressed in Chinese traditional dress or Western dress?
He has a baby suit.
Western suit. Guangzhou Emperor lapel pin. He is one of 3 that has the American flag lapel pin. Okay, so he's making a choice. He's making a statement with that. What about his hair? Does he just not have time to go to the barber? We don't know if he has a ponytail, to be honest, but I think he might be onto something because he has made a choice to not shave here. Right? You can tell that the last time, that recently, he made a choice to stop shaving his forehead. This might give us insight into his future, into his hopes and dreams, what he's considering. Again, we don't have documents from him. I don't know if he could write. But we can begin to read his mind, so to speak. We can interpret, we can infer. This guy fascinates me, right? I don't. We know the characters for his name. I don't know what he would have verbalized his name to be. So it's a bit, we're a bit stuck there. But going back to names, thank you for the transition. In 1870, we didn't know the names. China man, China woman, China boy. They were lost to the mists of the past. They used to be here, but they've since gone. Isn't that sad? If we could know more, we can know more. I started with this guy. I want to know his hopes and dreams, what he does, how he spends his time, and we can. His name is Hao Si. He's the state lecturer for the Chinese Empire Reform Association. He's visited almost all of the other cities, with the exception of the branch in Missoula. Oh, interesting. He's currently in Chicago, and he's going to go to Missoula in 2 weeks when he returns. He's a mover and a shaker. He's a leader in this. He's making choices with his hairstyle, with his dress. Fine. That far-off look that I talked about, he's got some hopes and dreams. He's seen obstacles, he's seen difficulties, but we can rescue some of his experience from the mists of the past. And so I think through this all, by seeing the Chinese in Montana, not just through a Montana history lens, but through a Chinese history lens, through a world history lens, we can give them more voice. We can recognize them as having agency, as being active participants in achieving their dreams, rather than as just in passive people to whom things happen. Questions for me on what we've talked about tonight? Yeah.
What about letters home? Does anybody ever research that?
I got to pay you $20 after this. Okay? Additional ways of knowing about the Chinese. As I was doing this research at the Montana Historical Society, I saw a reference in an 1866 English language newspaper that talked about a Chinese newspaper in Helena. I thought, fascinating. I've never heard of this Chinese newspaper in Helena in 1866. I would love to get my hands on that. And I thought to myself, having lived in China, I know that sometimes newspapers are pasted up for the community to read on the wall. And so I wondered if the Chinese newspaper that was referenced might be like that, instead of like a newspaper like we think about that's sitting in the entryway here at the beautiful event center. And so I asked the archivist, I said, hey, do you have anything in Chinese that you don't even know what it is, because you don't even know what it is? And the guy said, people have been through this story, like you're going to find something. I said, okay. So the next day I made a request for a box of documents that dealt with the Chinese in Montana. It didn't say anything about being in Chinese. And what came up was 95 documents all in Chinese. Now this is from a little bit later time period, from about 1898 to 1926. And working with my students from Shanghai, I wrote grants, I brought a number of students here to Helena to work to translate these documents. And we had grandparents and grandmas and Chinese teachers back in Shanghai working, so we digitized the documents, send it back, translate it back and forth, and we translated these 95 documents. They are mostly from the Chinese back in southern China writing to their relatives here. That makes sense, right? If there were letters, and I'm sure there were, that went the other direction, they'd be in southern China. And what we found is the hardship of southern China and the hopes and dreams they had for their relatives here in Montana. So this gentleman, De Chuan, time passes so fast, it's already been 10 years since we parted after we went to America. I haven't seen my brother come home on a boat. I can't sleep and I can't eat, but I hope you're doing well. I hope you're doing well in America, to have good health, good business, plenty of money, your hands are covered in gold. Buy a house soon and get our family to have a reunion. Then as a brother, I'll be happy and satisfied. But beware. Don't be like De Shu, who doesn't care for his parents or his ancestors' incense. He wanders outside, he changed his name, he bears descendants for other people. He got married, but he has no time to come home in his hometown. When he meets his brothers and other relatives, he's sorrowful and ashamed. He wants to bring his wife and child home, but he has no home in his home, no house in his hometown. So with this cautionary tale of the black sheep, they're saying, hey, you know how we expect you to behave. You've got familial obligations, And there was pressure on these Chinese in Montana. Come home, I'm writing today to tell brother, I've got an idea for you. I've got a business proposition. I decided on buying a house. We have to think about each other. Be a man, my brother. Hanoi and China from 1926. And so the pressure on this guy here in Butte was enormous. And he thinks his hands are covered in gold. We uncovered other documents that show this guy was in deep debt. He was sending as much as he could back home and incurring debts here just to support his family back home. But they have these hopes and dreams, and he's got these obligations, so it was complicated. And as we were doing this research, that box of 95 documents that came up, one day they made a mistake and brought the wrong box of Chinese documents up. It had 250 Chinese letters for a totally different story, from the 1930s to the 1950s, dealing with this gentleman, Ham Wing Hung. And he comes to Butte in the 1930s. He works in a laundry. He's about 14 when he gets through immigration. He comes to Butte. He was detained in immigration for 6 weeks as they questioned him and sent these records all over America to cross-reference and triangulate, is he telling the truth, with extremely detailed questions to this 14-year-old. Finally, he's let in. He's recognized as an American citizen. Now that's complicated. He was born in China. I've told you that they couldn't become naturalized citizens. How could he be an American citizen? Well, his father had been born in China too, but his father had been born in San Francisco in 1878. And so, like when I lived in China for 8 years, if I had a child in China, what would their status of citizenship be? It would follow my status of citizenship. They would be an American citizen, just like these gentlemen. So the grandfather was born in San Francisco. He goes back to China and has a child. That child is an American citizen through what's called derivative citizenship. He comes and works back and forth from America back to China. He has children. That is Ham Wing Hung and his brother. His brother is Wing Yun Hung. So Ham Wing Hung works as a laundry worker. But I told you before that the Chinese in Butte have been prohibited in working in underground mines for 60 years. He's the first one who's allowed to work in the underground mines. He gets a job in the Mountain Pond mine in 1941. Why would they need workers in mines in 1941? The war effort. And so possibly that loosened restrictions with manpower needs, with men being sent off to fight, and the mines needing to produce more copper. He seizes this opportunity, becomes the first Chinese miner in more than 6 decades. But his brother and his family is still stuck back in southern China as the Japanese are ravaging that part of the world. And he works to try and get his brother out of China, get him here to Montana. Now, if Ham Wing Hung had been recognized as a citizen, what should Ham Wing Gun's status be too? A citizen. He should be allowed to come into the United States. From about 1948 through the end of the 1950s, the brother in Butte works to try and get the brother stuck in Hong Kong into America. And that's what those 250 letters are. The back and forth, constantly changing immigration restrictions, constantly changing requirements for the proof that they need to give to establish their identity. In fact, Ham Wing Gun, writing from Hong Kong in 1953, talks about, I beg you to find a powerful and renowned Westerner. Ask him to be the guarantor of my documents. It's just not working. We need somebody with a little bit more juice. Ask the Westerner with his reputation and authority to write a request to the Department of State to accept my application to come to America. Brother, I beg you to find a powerful Westerner quickly to help me. I'm in a dire situation. My present chance is slim. Ham Wing Hung goes to a powerful Westerner, Senator Mike Mansfield, and asks for his assistance. Even that wasn't enough. Ham Wing Gun never gets out of Hong Kong, eventually goes back home to Taishan, and the two brothers are never reunited. So, your question about other letters, yeah, and it tells fascinating stories, and it helps us view these people as people with hopes and dreams and ambitions and obstacles, instead of just saying they're shrouded in the mists of the past.
What did your students say? Did they have comments or anything when they were translating?
Yeah, it was fascinating. So we did this twice. We did it in 2012 and 2014. The difficulty was those language barriers. Because I'm teaching in Shanghai, and I was teaching in Shanghai. The written language has been simplified. In the 1950s, the communists simplified the written language to try and spread education, and it worked. Literacy rates skyrocketed. But the traditional writing style here, which is more complicated and elaborate, 1.4 billion Chinese in mainland China can't read it. So I went to my Mandarin teachers at the school I was teaching at and I said, hey, can you help me read these documents? And they could read about 30% of it because they grew up in communist China with the simplified writing style. And so I needed to find Chinese families who had connection to the traditional writing style. Anyone know where the traditional writing style is still used? Dr. Lee? Taiwan. And so I had a number of Taiwanese families who they were trained in that traditional style, and so I tapped into their expertise and their knowledge, and the knowledge and expertise of their mothers and fathers, and the knowledge and expertise of their grandparents. It was this amazing multi-generational project. Brought them here to Helena, took them to Marysville Ghost Town, Montana. Right? It was fascinating. And of these students, several of them have gone on to pursue this. One of them currently has just finished a master's in history. Another one just finished his BA in history. He's been accepted to Columbia Law School and wants to be a historian, a legal historian moving forward. So they caught the bug. I mean, I was blessed to work with some amazing students and to find these documents and to then try and use my understanding of Montana history and world history to try and tell this story. Other questions?
We have no documentation of who these people were, but when they came from their countries, did they have any documentation that they left for America?
When they came through the immigration procedure, there was a lot of documentation, but it's quite strange. The people trying to, in terms of immigration, you have Ellis Island on the East Coast processing European immigrants. Really, I know there are some stories about names being changed and things like that, and that wasn't a pleasant experience, but it wasn't designed to bar these immigrants. Immigration on the West Coast was very much designed to catch Chinese immigrants in falsehoods. Angel Island, which was created in 1910, and before that the other immigration ports were designed to catch these people who they thought were telling lies to get into America by claiming to be the son of this person, or claiming to be the brother of this and that. And so there was constantly more and more evidence needed for them to prove who they were. And every time that evidence was ratcheted up and they met that bar, new evidence was invented. So the story of these brothers is this heartbreaking story of them submitting every affidavit, every payment, every blood test, every bone scan. And sometimes the laws changed so quickly that in the time they submitted it, from the time they got a response, the law changed and there's new requirements. It was a heartbreaking story. So there's mountains of that type of documentary evidence. But in terms of what they think, what they understand, what their hopes and dreams are, there's precious little evidence. And so as we crack into these documents, we can tell their frustrations, their ideas, we've got some from his sister writing from southern China talking about how she wants him to send her a fountain pen from America. She knows that he's just in America, just spending time going to movies and things like that. We've got his mother writing and saying, be careful in your mining job. We know it's dangerous. And there are 2 accident reports held at the Butte Civil War Archives that attest to Wing Hong Hom getting injured in mining cave-ins. So we began to understand. This has been a multi-year project, and partnering with those families that I taught, was trying to tell the story in more thorough ways. Kathleen, you have a question?
I was just wondering, what did the United States government think of, did they have any takes on how this was playing out in China, the reform with the emperor?
That's a good question. I didn't see much about that. I didn't see a whole lot about that. Yeah. No, and it's fascinating that the Chinese, the change in the centuries-old system was playing out not just in China, but here as well. This is Sun Yat-sen, who maybe you've heard of, and so he will eventually be the gentleman responsible for the revolution that toppled the Qing dynasty. And he's in America raising money for that effort. But he does not want the Qing dynasty, he does not want the Guangxi emperor put back on the throne. He wants emperors done. He's very anti-Manchu. This is a foreign government. This Qing dynasty was not Chinese, they were Manchu, part of Asia. And so Sun Yat-sen does not agree with the Chinese Empire Reform Association. Here are his travels as he went around raising money for his revolutionary party. You'll notice he avoids Montana, right? He's actually in Denver When the Qing dynasty collapses, he's staying at the Brown Palace Hotel, if you've ever been to Denver, raising money from Chinese communities to try and topple the Qing dynasty and put his government in power. His system does win. The Qing dynasty collapses. By that time, this is 1911, 1912, the Chinese Empire Reform Association had fizzled because the Guangxu Emperor died. He died November 14th, 1908, and the Dowager Empress died November 15th, 1908. Coincidence? What we now know is that the Guangxu Emperor had arsenic levels in his system 2,000 times the normal rate. It's thought that he was poisoned. It's thought that the Dowager Empress had some of her henchmen poison the Guangxu Emperor because she knew she was close to dying. And if she died and the Guangxu Emperor took over, he's going to reinstitute these reforms and take China in a direction that she didn't agree with. And so at that point in time, the Qing dynasty is really on its last legs. The revolution in 1911, 1912 establishes the Republic of China, led by the ideas of Sun Yat-sen, though he doesn't remain in power in that government very long. Yeah, in terms of America's interactions with this, I didn't see a lot. We had diplomats over there and things like that, but not a lot of weighing in on one side or another. Other questions? I think you can tell I enjoy talking about this, so I'm going to be here all night. I know it's a cold night and we've got families and things to get home to, so maybe one more question and we can wrap up. They're still at the Montana Historical Society. Interesting story. So they're from Butte, not Helena. The Montana Historical Society is in Helena. Well, the May Wah building is where they've been housed down in Butte. Again, today it's a wonderful museum. Back in the 1980s, it was falling apart. And there was all these Chinese documents and Chinese artifacts that were kept in the May Wah building. Not yet a museum. But the roof was beginning to leak and the documents were in danger of being damaged. Also, if you know Butte history, there was some incidents of arson throughout that time period. And so some caretakers of the building were very worried about the documents and arranged with the Montana Historical Society to have them transferred from Butte up to Helena. So these are Butte-based Chinese documents that are housed in Helena, where they're preserved. Now, however, the May Wah Museum and the Butte Silver Bow Archives do have the facilities to take care of these documents, but I don't know if they're going to get them back. There's some fascinating documents. I found this map. It's about this big. A map of Taishan County. It was commissioned in 1893 by the Guangxu Emperor, done with great detail. It's crumbling and falling apart. I still don't know. I've asked experts around the world why they think a map that was commissioned by the Guangxu Emperor, done by a high official, is in Butte. And nobody's able to tell me that answer. So there's still mysteries to unlock. But I keep working on this story and just try to work to tell it in a way that honors these people as active participants in their own destiny. Other questions, right? Let's hear.
How was the other empires in the world, like the British Empire, involved in this?
Yeah, how was the British Empire involved in this? Very good question. So the British Empire probably began the beginning of the end of the Chinese Empire. So in the late 1800s, England wanted into the Chinese market. The British had become obsessed with tea. It was estimated that as much as a common Englishman would spend as much as 10% of his annual salary on tea. And the Chinese have a monopoly on tea. And so they wanted to crack into that. I'd probably spend more than that on coffee, to be honest. They wanted to crack into that China trade, but really England didn't have anything that China wanted, and so there was an imbalance of trade. England wanted the tea, China didn't need anything draining. However, there were certain parts of China that were deteriorating and not doing very well, and the British had control of Afghanistan and India, where opium was grown, and they began inserting opium, which had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. But then it began to be abused by people who were suffering through hard times. And opium addiction ran rampant throughout China. Now the British fought wars to insert this opium into China in the 1840s. The Treaty of Nanking happened in 1843, and it started what the Chinese referred to as 100 years of humiliation. So the British defeated the Chinese in 1843, led to 100 years of humiliation, roughly speaking. Again, by 100 days of reform, 103 days. So when did the 100 years of humiliation end? Well, if you're from mainland China, you believe it ended October 1st, 1949, with the victory of Mao Zedong and the communists. If you're from America or places that don't like communism, you think that's when China fell. If you think that that was good for China, you think that that's the birth of new China. But all that started with the power of the British Empire. And the French were involved, and the Russians were involved, and the Germans were involved, and the Americans were involved in going in and carving up China for their own purposes.
Was that part of the Boxer Rebellion?
Boxer Rebellion was a little bit later. It happened up in northern China. It was very much anti-foreign, and then it began to be anti-Manchu, anti-Qing dynasty as well. The part of it in terms of they chafed against foreign control of China. I looked for evidence of the Boxer Rebellion reverberating through the Chinese communities in America, and I didn't see that. Mostly because I think the Boxer Rebellion was so much about northern China, and the Chinese who came to Montana and America were southern Chinese. I just don't think it had connectedness. Plus that happened in 1900, not yet the time when this Chinese Empire Reform Association really solidified that national identity. Thank you for your interest tonight. You can tell I enjoy talking about this with people who are interested and bring something to the conversation. I appreciate your interest in this opportunity to talk. I'll be around for a little bit if you want to ask any personal questions. Sure. So I'm happy for this guest lecture series here at Dawson Community College. I'll be back, I believe it's April 9th, Tuesday, April 9th. I'll be talking about resistance during the Holocaust. Another very cheery topic, right? But oftentimes when we think about the Holocaust, we hear those massive death tolls. 6 million or 11 million, depending on which populations you're counting. And it can be a very bleak story, and it should be a bleak story. It was this catastrophic event. But I think there's moments of inspiration that can be looked at when we look at how there was spiritual resistance, educational resistance, sometimes personal and military resistance to the efforts of the Nazis during that time period. So that's what I'll be talking about in April. And I believe there's another talk coming up in February about the 1919 Spanish influenza epidemic that ravaged the world, and reverberations here in Montana. Right? Tell your friends. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.